advanced web forms. One thing I'm trying, an experimental thing in this presentation, like I love live demos, but I'm going to try not to do one. And just because it makes it easier for me to talk and not have to click at the same time. We'll see how that goes. My introduction, hello, my name's Jacob Rockowitz. I'm known as Jay Rockowitz on the web. I'm a Drupal developer and software architect. I built and maintained the WebForm module for Drupal 8. So for this presentation, I added a slide after I set up everything just to make a point. Like, there's a lot of resources out there for learning the basics of WebForm module. And this is an advanced presentation. And it really should teach you a few new things and just inspire you to learn more. Like, you're not, like, personally I like presentations where things go over my head and I have to walk out and think about it and learn, you know. And at some point I'm like, aha, I understand that concept. So building advanced web forms requires leveraging hooks, understanding plugins, building render arrays, and writing tests. And kind of funny is I still want to go over some basics before I get into the advanced stuff. And it's really just about the use case of the WebForm module is a powerful and flexible open source form builder and submission manager for Drupal 8. And this is like my elevator pitch for the module. It provides all the features expected from an enterprise proprietary form builder combined with the flexibility and openness of Drupal. And the flexibility and openness of Drupal is kind of the focus of this advanced presentation. It's trying to make people comfortable with what you can do, how flexible WebForm plugins are, and what you can do with it. And you know, just a quick use case that I've kind of included in almost all my presentations. WebForm modules for building a form, publishing that, collecting some data, sending confirmations and notifications, reviewing these results, and then distributing them either by using a remote post or downloading a CSV. And it's really just like build, collect, distribute. It's a really simple goal. And the demo, and so what I'm trying to do instead of doing live demos is I'm experimenting with recording the demo, and I can hit play and I can talk while it goes. So this is the demo, it's my elevator pitch. Here's a contact form, out of the box, comes with the WebForm module. And this is the UI for building the form. And all we're going to do is just add a simple accompany element. Select a text field, get to it, type in company, which I already did, and I'm just expanding all the features, and you're just scrolling through. These are all the different little settings you can do. Once it's added, we'll switch over to the view, and you can see the fields added at the bottom. This is a deliberate mistake because it says company at the bottom when it really should say your company and should be towards the top of the form. I'm toggling over to the source mode, so you can edit the source code behind the web form. And this is the YAML render array, where you can literally cut and paste your elements and move them around and manipulate the entire form at once. It's really useful for editing labels for an entire form, or like reviewing what's going on. Even for advanced developers, you just be able to debug what the heck's happening. So now I'm jumping over to the test tab, where it just populates the form with dummy data, and you can just test it and generate one submission. And now I'm going to jump over, so we've kind of done the form, got the data, and this is the results in the back end, where you can view the individual submission, get the metadata, and even manage that submission in this view. And then there's the tabs you need to do the CRUD operations, editing. And now I'm jumping over to downloading it. This is that distribute. This is just taking that data, and I'm using the example here of creating an HTML table that you can open in Microsoft Excel. Like if that checkbox wasn't checked, this would have opened in Excel. That is pretty much it, I think. Yep. All right. So that's like we've just gone through everything that happens in the WebForm module, and now the focus is, well, what's some of the technical details behind it? I have these resource tabs throughout the slides. If you look at the slides, you can look at the links. I'm not going to talk about them, but I really want to give people more information to jump off of. Okay, let's keep going. So doing something different where I'm putting testing first in this presentation, because I think it's important, and usually if you put it at the end, you run out of time and forget to talk about it. And with testing web forms, this is, to me, one of the most important slides, is just to say test confirm expectations. That's all I feel when all these different testing frameworks come out and all these different ways of doing testing. But the goal, you need to figure out what your goal is. And for me, when I do tests, is to make sure things work as I expect. And I'll emphasize that a little more as I go through. But in web forms, what I've kind of figured out with the tests is there's these 5 things that are pretty common. It's testing whether something gets rendered correctly, how it's processed, default value, whether the default value is processed correctly, and validation. Once someone hits submit, what happens in that test? And then the last two are pretty important. Is like there's a lot of settings to the WebForm module. So there's lots of individual tests for settings. And access controls, I think, across the board. Anything you build that has any type of access control, it's absolutely critical to write tests for access controls. I've learned from experience with Alex in the WebForm issue queue, if you don't have enough test coverage, you screw up and something gets exposed. Some best practices related to the WebForm module. WebForm modules are config entities, and I'll explain a little more in a bit, but you can export them into a test form. It makes your life really easy. If you're doing some custom stuff, you can create like a custom instance of the form you're kind of expecting to build, and then you can write tests against individual elements. And this is something I have learned, and I think, if you look at what's going on in design systems where everything's component driven, tests really need to be broken down into components. Every element you create, if you do custom elements, needs to have an individual test. It makes things so much easier. I used to have like one big test that tests like 20 elements, and as we go through it, you'll see, I focus on individual elements. It makes it a lot easier to debug things. And as you write a lot of tests, try to look for repeatable testing patterns. Like if you're doing the same thing over and over again in your tests, that can save a lot of time. And also organizing them into groups and subdirectories. Like access controls, I always put in an access directory so that the tests are easy to get to. Also, when people get heavy into tests, manual tests are okay sometimes. I mean, because like I have a lot of JavaScript integrations with third-party CDNs. There's no real way to write automated tests, but I have a quick way to manually go confirm that Google's location API is still working correctly. And some tests are better than no tests. I think that's another really important thing if you're hesitant to write tests is if you can just write a baseline test for some piece of functionality, at least when that breaks, you can go in and start expanding the test. If you have no test, then you're starting from scratch. Let's see if we can keep going. This is an important statement because I'm going to show some stuff related to tests. The WebForm module is still heavily using simple tests, and we need to migrate them to PHP unit. That is the way you should write tests in Drupal 8. So let's, all right. I'm going to pause it for a second so I can get it right. So this is the full dev environment that I use where all the tests are turned on. So there's 200 different forms to test each individual piece of functionality. And what I want to show here is, like, for example, with confirmation messages, there's 7 different confirmation messages, and we can test an individual one where you can look at how modals work. And now I'm really going to jump, let's see where we're going here. Okay, this is just showing you the test. These are all the different forms for confirmation modals, like confirmations. Each one gets a single little test just to confirm that it renders as I would expect and goes through it. And what I also like about this is WebForms, when they're exported, they're easy to test because you can install them. You don't have to like debug your test necessarily. You can actually have a live form to work off of. I'm just showing the inline and how you can quickly review it. Now just to jump over elements. Every element, so every WebForm has some custom email elements. These are some tests. There's a dedicated form. The example would be this is a multiple value, so you can enter comma-delimited emails. And I'm going to jump over and show you the form. And the test is doing exactly what I'm doing here. Fill out some data. It's not valid. Hit submit. You get an error. And this is just kind of giving you the highlight of, yep, it's a config install directory that installs all of these web forms, and then you can kind of run through them manually too. Also, there's a lot of test modules, and I think with testing, it's really important to emphasize you can create test modules that just like encapsulate some functionality. I think I'm going to go to, for example, Lingotech. Well, paragraphs, there's a test module just to get a bunch of paragraphs set up. But then like Lingotech, which I don't have a lot of automated tests because you need API keys and stuff, but I have a way to just set up an environment to verify, like just manually see that Lingotech's working as I would expect. Okay. Skipping past the resources. So entities. I mean, everything in Drupal is an entity or a plugin. And an entity is, any defined chunk of data in Drupal that includes things like nodes, users, taxonomy terms, files. And I think really I need to contribute a module can define entities. That's what WebForm is doing. And this is a WebForm entity. It's a form. And this is a WebForm submission entity because it's a submission coming through. And there are some differences because WebForms are config entities. The key word behind saying something's a config entity is it's exportable. It can be put into a YAML file and moved from one system to another fairly easily. pretty easily. Submissions are content entities. That goes into the database. That's a different system. But one important thing that I need to distinguish about WebForms is it's not relying on Field API to store data. It's using something called submissions are stored in an entity attribute value model. And this is the long-winded wording definition of it. I don't even need to read the whole thing, because the key point is it's a simple way to store a lot of data. And to understand it, it's worth looking at the database for a second. And this is the table for just the content entity, the WebForm submission content entity. Pretty standard of just some properties, the ID, token, created, timestamps. But the table that's really storing all the data is this one, and it's only 6 columns. And this really breaks down entity attribute value. So the entity, WebForm ID and submission ID, that's what defines what you're trying to store. And the attribute really has to do with the element, so name, property, and delta. The name would be the name of the element. So let's say you had an address, that would go in the name field. But addresses have state, city. They go into property, those individual state and city. And deltas for multiple values. So if you're collecting multiple addresses, address 1 would have delta actually 0, because of course that's how it works in programming world. And then value, a simple string column to store the value. Okay, so to kind of just reinforce what's going on with any, this is my one problem with the videos is you got to toggle back and forth sometimes. Let's see if we can get it to go. Pause. So now I have the devel module, and it's great to just look at, these are all the entities that are provided by core, and you can see all the WebForm entities. I'm only focusing on 2 of them right now, but it gives you the idea that almost every feature has an entity behind it. And devel gives you this opportunity to kind of browse through it in the UI. You can also look at it through code. But now I just want to emphasize the exportable stuff here. So we're back to the contact form, and there's an export tab. And this is an exportable config entity. This is all the data behind a single web form in one file that shows you all the settings. I'm going to scroll down and kind of point out, even the access controls are here. The emails, how an email is being sent out and formatted, and you can download it and move it to one system to the other. For emphasizing content entities submissions, there's an API tab in the test tab if you install the WebForm devel module. And this just shows you, this is that data that we were just looking at. And this is just giving you API examples of how to push that data into the database. I actually think, one thing I want to emphasize, because we're getting more into a headless system and people are starting to use JSON API, I think that tab's going to get expanded more with samples of how to push data using different APIs, like a JSON API example, a REST API example with some curl commands. Moving ahead, some more resources. The source entity. So a source entity tracks and creates a relationship to the Drupal entity from which a web form was submitted. And so source entities allow a web form to be reused multiple times. You can take one web form and attach it to multiple nodes and track which nodes it's going to. And the way that tracking works, when I talk about web form nodes, you're tracking it based on the route, because you're looking at the node's route and you see that there's a node there. Or you can use a query string. And so web form nodes use source entities. Blocks, can you also track the source entity when you place a block on every page of your site? And even paragraphs uses source entities. So if you put a web form in a paragraph, it'll figure out what the main entity is of that paragraph and start tracking submissions for that main entity. And going back to the submission table, this is what a source entity is. It's just entity type and ID. Entity type being a node and ID being node 1, 2, whatever. Very similar to how comments work. Comments use the exact same schema to attach comments throughout your site. And when you're in the UI, this is what a source entity is, submitted to. So we're on a registration form, and this is showing all the different events that this single registration form has been submitted from. And so what you can do with source entities, it opens up site feedback is the most simple use case to explain source entities. You take a block and say, give me some feedback, and you place it on every page of your site. And that feedback is tracked per page. So you're getting kind of like it's like comments or a feedback form. That's the most basic use case. The more common one that a lot of people are doing is event registration systems. So you have event nodes, and you attach a registration form below that node. And when people hit submit, you're tracking registrations for that event, only that event. And then the application evaluation is a really rich one that gradually people are more expanding on. That's where you have like an application someone fills out online, a web form application, they fill it out, they get the submission, and then at the submission, at the bottom of it, you attach a web form. That is an evaluation. So you're creating this pattern, this application evaluation, so you can have people submit their reviews of a job application and then review all of them and even create aggregate scores. For event registration application, there are demos within the WebForm module that you can use as starting points. And for source entities, let's see. Just kind of showing you, we're on the contact form. Oh, this is the main form where it shows you all the submissions coming in. The contact form, we've got 50 submissions already on the contact form. Go to the references tab, and you can create quickly your web form node. So this is a web form node. Contact's been passed in, so everything's pre-filled for you. This makes it very easy. You just literally don't have to do anything other than hit save. And now we have this dedicated web form node for contact with a node, node URL. You can run a test, and the key thing I want to emphasize about source entities is we've done one test here, and we go back and go to results. You're only seeing this one result for this node. Not all, even though you can see the IDs incremented up to 52 because those other results are somewhere else. And now we want to just look at plugins, and I'll really define them in a second, but this is the source entity plugin. So this is the query string one. Scrolling through, it's a really simple one. All it's doing is looking at the current parameters and seeing, well, did you pass in a source entity type in the URL and an ID, and it does some access controls to make sure those are legitimate source entities. There's another one for doing it based on the route, and Alex, you do deserve credit for this work, so. It's just looking at the current route. He did the refactoring to make these plugins, which just makes it easier to, actually what plugins do is make it easier to understand the code. And I love this plugin because it's this simple. It's a plugin that just has one method to it. The interface is get source entity, and that's all we're doing here. And I started with this because we're going to get into some more complex plugins. Okay. Form API. By the way, we're talking a lot about not web form related stuff necessarily, but Form API, so web forms are render arrays which contain elements that build, validate, and submit form values using Drupal's Form API, or FAPI. And render arrays, just to give a definition so people know what I'm talking about, they're just the basic building blocks of Drupal content. So anything you see on a page is a render array. The header is a render array. If you see a block, that's going to be a render array that's outputted, and forms are the same thing. And forms, an overview of just forms in Drupal, an element is anything displayed on a page. So forms are made up of elements. I like to kind of go and say further and say, an input is an element that collects data. And then there is this concept of composites in core that WebForm has run with, but composites are a group of inputs elements working together, but really inputs, and the example in core would be radio buttons. So it's a group of radio buttons that collect data, or checkboxes. And a form is just a collection of elements and inputs working together. And yeah, I show this slide a lot because this is a form. And the reason I'm showing it to you is so that this is the form and this is the render array that's building that form. This is a YAML, this is how WebForm does it. And it's showing you, how it's broken down. I'm going to break this down a little bit more in a second. But I also want to emphasize that, Form API is mostly PHP, and this is the same YAML as PHP. The only thing different here is that the strings are being translated because it's PHP code. And yeah, this is what forms do. I think people are familiar with it, but it's important to emphasize the simplicity once you start wrapping it. It's you build a form, you validate it, you submit it. And I'm going to re-emphasize that by just walking through some quick form stuff. Okay. I really start here because these are all forms. All configuration in Drupal are forms. And for me, the first form I ever learned how Drupal works was the site details as a really simple form. It actually, it's 5 text fields. And this is the form, and you can go explore these and get more familiar with how forms are working in Drupal. And what I'm just doing is walking through. It's pretty simple because here's this render array. What you just looked at, this is what's going to be outputted. The validate is interesting because it's a little more complex because there are cores doing a lot of validation on the types of piece of information. But here's the submit, storing the data. But here's the interface. And I think I'm doing this because I want to emphasize the importance of looking at interfaces when you're trying to understand code. This has 4 methods. Get form ID, because every form needs to be unique. And then we're back to build, validate, and submit. That's it. One of the best interfaces to show people in core. to really get understanding of Form API and other aspects is to look at the examples module. And it includes examples, Form API examples. And you can click through and get to like really simple form examples where it's just a really basic form. It's a starting point. You can copy this code. You can work with it and start to really understand, tweak it and understand the mechanics. And they have examples of advanced AJAX. And I mean, this is the only place you're going to really understand how to use AJAX in forms. Okay. More resources. Okay, creating form elements. So form elements, a form element is defined using a render array, which is processed by a render element plugin, which creates an input on a form. It's a lot to digest, but it's important to kind of give a definition of plugins. And plugins are small pieces of functionality that are swappable. And I like to break it down to these three things, that they're reusable, standardized, and extendable. And that's why Drupal so heavily pushes them, because it just compartmentalizes little pieces of functionality that you can go in and kind of reuse. I mean, the reuse is so key, and we're going to keep talking about like a lot of inheritance going on in the WebForm module because it makes life easier. But before I get into it, I really want to just, form elements are plugins. Form elements extend render elements. And to me, these are the two key things to understand form elements when you're building them in the WebForm UI. Properties begin with a hash, and every element must have a key. And this kind of just lays out like a very simple element. We were just looking at this, your name, and here's your properties, the type. You're going to do a text field. And I'm illustrating that you can also add custom attributes here. Just background color, some classes, and very important is always the key. And this is the output. This is the markup that's coming through. And what I really like about this is the output that Drupal generates. And what's really important to say is it does a lot of nice defaults and things for you, like setting a max length and adding all this extra CSS that you can work with. And then there's your custom stuff, your custom class and your background color. And for form elements, to understand them, I kind of broke it down. There's a lot that could go on, but you need to define what the properties are when you're building your own custom form elements. And then you have to set how an input value is going to work, the value callback. How does that default value get processed? And then these three are kind of, think about build out, how are you building the element, how that element's going to be processed, and once it's done being processed, how it's going to be rendered. And then the big one, especially with advanced elements, is how is that going to be validated? How are you going to manipulate the data? And yeah, this is important. So form elements, you should always copy and extend an existing element. That's just a given. Because very rarely you're going to need to start from complete scratch. I mean, even just copying a simple text field and then working from there can help. This is a tricky one to kind of emphasize to people. This is like a weird nuance in Drupal's form API, is that pound element validate, that's a callback to validate the data coming in. It's also the only callback you have to manipulate the data when someone hits submit on a form. The best example I can give for that is password confirmation. So you have two passwords, you want to get someone's password, and the way Drupal works is it renders two password fields, you enter in A and B, comes back, it validates it, obviously checks that A and B match, but then it says, don't submit A and B, just submit one value. And what's weird in Drupal is that's done in the validation callback. So you're kind of manipulating data as you're validating it. And as you explore certain elements, especially advanced web form elements, you're going to see that behavior. And for composite elements, when you're creating multiple elements working together, you have to use this property called pound tree. It allows all that data to come in as an associative array. So it makes it easy to manipulate. So for this demo, by the way, I know this is a lot to digest. Whew. Okay. I'm using Devel again because Devel has these awesome tools to just show you every element that you have installed. And I'm just showing you the web form elements that are installed. And here you can just get a sense of what's available. And this is also showing you there's a text field. And actually, text fields are a good place to start. We're in Core's core render element, where all the elements are. And what I want to do is jump to a text field and just say, here, this is an example of a text field. I copied this multiple times because it's got good documentation. Gives you this idea. You're defining, okay, these are the properties. This is how the value is going to be handled. I want to pause because I love this little snippet of code in the text field handler. This is some awesome stuff that Drupal does that I didn't realize until I read the code. I thought this was a given HTML feature. It's where if you accidentally have carriage returns in your single line text field, they set up this behavior to strip those out, which makes a lot of sense. You don't lose data. It takes the carriage returns and just removes them. Moving forward, I mean, it's really a simple plugin. This is all about how it's going to be outputted. What are the attributes that you want to send out to the client? And lastly, let's see, the form element interface, this is a weird interface because you'd expect it to have a lot more going on. It just has a value callback because that's like the most important thing about collecting data is how are you going to process that? How are you going to render the value? What are you going to get? Okay. So creating web form elements, this is where we're getting into really the web form stuff. Web form elements are wrappers around form API elements. And for web form element plugins to work, it requires a corresponding form element. So you have to have an existing core, a form API element. And both the plugins, the web form element plugin and your form element, have to have the same ID. So the same pound type. Text field would be an example. And web form element plugins handle everything related to an element. They encapsulate all the behaviors you could possibly see happening for a single element in web forms. Base classes help a lot to organize related elements. So all text field, text-related elements extend a text-based class that handles most of the hard work. And traits are a great concept in object-oriented code, in my opinion. I mean, some people argue differently, but that just allows you to take a bunch of behavior and stick it in a class and reuse it in different places. And it's, the example in web forms is entity references heavily rely on traits because a render you have an entity reference to a select menu, and that element's a select menu. But how it behaves, you can use traits to kind of encapsulate how the references are loaded, how it's manipulated. So for form element plugins, these are kind of the breakdown is you got to define the properties, very similar to get info, but get the default properties, how to prepare when you're going to render it, determining what the behaviors are. And one big difference of web form element plugins, I wish that slide title got fixed, but is you're also deciding how you're going to build the HTML and the output. Like what are you going to show in that submission view? What are you going to send in email? And if you're going to export it, you're going to want to define how the table columns are going to work. And then ultimately a big feature is how the UI is going to look. How is that form going to render? And okay. So the web form has, in the report section, you can get to web form plugins, and this gives you an overview of all the plugins that the web form module uses. So this is all the elements available, all 87, which is ridiculous. But and what it helps for developers do is it gives you an idea of the class hierarchy, and it gives you this test. I want to back up for 1 second. Good, it stayed paused. This gives you a really good visual breakdown of how, like for example, this email field extends the web form element base, but then it spends text base, and then it has the email element. And it just shows you kind of what behaviors are available. And as you're starting to go through code, you'll start to understand these more. But for example, knowing that it's an input is a good example. The other one that I like to point out, if it's a composite element, you kind of have to track all this metadata to be able to manipulate the values as they come in. I'm going to keep going because now it jumps to, by the way, this emphasizes the importance of being able to test a single piece of functionality. So you're able to test an individual element in this UI without any form behaviors around it or anything. It just gives you this way to understand how this element's going to work when you start entering in like help text. And it'll scroll down, give it a second, and generate literally the sample element. There's that element you just created, and there's the markup behind it. It's a good way to get familiar with the source, behind each element, the YAML source. Let's see. All right. So for web form elements, this is the directory, web form plugin, web form element. These are all the different elements that are available. Each one has a dedicated plugin. I think we're going to jump over to the text field, which is interesting because it's a fair, you saw how simple the form API element is. This is fairly simple. All you're seeing is these custom behaviors being added in, input mass, counters. And then I like this little thing I decided to do was, I just couldn't, I think core is at 128 character limit for a text field. I couldn't deal with it. So I kind of set it to 255 because it seems like what most people expect for text fields. And then this is the interface, and this is a very long scrolling interface, but it breaks down everything related to an element. So it encapsulates all the behaviors that you could possibly have. And we're really looking at just has multiple values. And now we're getting into the rendering. Initialize. Let's see if we get there. Sorry. I want to pause it because it's so... I mean, I think with this slide, what's important is it's like you got to look at the interfaces behind everything you're working on. And I tried my best to do some grouping of different behaviors, where this is the behavior that if you want to generate a preview of an element, it'll make it possible to render a reasonable example with some default values or default settings. And let me see where I scroll to, because, yeah, this is a helper to just get the test values. If you're generating those test forms for your, like for example, that's heavily used, like the manage file upload. That method's used to like create test files that you can put into the data, not in the database, but get stored, get uploaded. And finally, there's the good old form at the bottom. Now, I'll let it go through, but what I'm emphasizing is there's examples in the WebForm module to help you understand how these plugins work. So this is an example of a composite element. And it just gives you a starting point that you can copy and work from. And let it scroll down, and I'll emphasize. It's just to create a kind of a mock address-like field. Show you like you need a theme. That's what the modules do. They give you all the little code snippets you need to start working from. And this is just giving you an example of building a really simple element, which is first name, last name, date of birth, and gender. And it's also including some complex conditional logic, because composites get a little complex with their conditionals. And what the example modules also include is the idea that you want to make sure everything's easy to test. So it has an example form that literally builds out what we just looked at in the code. And you can go test just the behaviors. I mean, literally, if you were doing this, my recommendation, you copy the module and take this example and move it over into a test module. So then you can make sure this is always working the way you expect. And that's it. So we looked at an example of composite. There's an example of a very basic element, too, of just like where to start with creating your own element. All right. So for creating custom elements, you want to create a custom module, extend or copy an existing plugin. And it's important, you start off with a form element. So you got to create your form element first. And once you have a form element that works, you can build a form that tests it. You can go into the source code and type out that element and get it rendering. And then once you have that form element behaving the way you want, you can start layering in the WebForm element plugin functionality, where you're trying to build out the UI and custom. Usually it's really to build out the UI. If you have custom properties, you need to expose them. And once you get that plugin started, you start testing the integration, and ultimately, you got to write tests. So, okay, we are switching gears and kind of wrapping up in the sense of we've talked heavily about building forms, and now we're switching over to that collecting data. And it comes down to implementing handlers. And WebForm handler plugin are used to route submitted data to applications and send email notifications. And these are handlers. This is in the UI. You go through and you can get a list of scheduling email, remote posts. The email handler, which I showed before, which generates a confirmation email, this is the handler UI. Let me see if we can get, so the overview, handler plugins, they contain methods that kind of act like hooks. And handlers react to a submission state. It's an important thing that people don't totally realize that once you get a handler in place, there's all these different states to a submission. Like if you save a draft, that's a state. If you complete a draft, if you hit, you save a draft, that's a state. You go and hit submit, that's a completed state. And then if you go in and update a submission, that's an update, and it actually will capture when a submission is deleted. And at the bottom, I'm just kind of including, because people don't totally realize, it's like, more powerful feature is handlers support conditional logic. It's really, so you can decide when a handler should be triggered, if an email should be sent based on a certain text field or a drop-down menu. And the overview of handlers, it gets a little simpler because it's really, yes, you're defining your configuration. Emphasize override settings, so this is a really powerful behavior to handlers, is they can manipulate any aspect of a web form, any behavior. So in a handler, you can use override settings to go in and say, I want a different confirmation message. I want it to behave totally differently. And you just go override the settings. And it's done pretty well because when you override the settings, there's no risk of contaminating your web form's data because it locks it so it can't be saved. But you can manipulate the hell out of what's going to go on. Then we get into some more standard concept in Drupal of just being able to, in handlers, you're able to alter elements and forms. And all entity operations are available in a handler. So anything you think of as an entity operation, here I'm saying post save, but you could do post, pre, save, delete, up. And then the other one that's a little nuanced, and it's a very specific use case to be aware of, is any action that's happening with elements you can capture. The example for that would be if you're doing a heavy integration with like Salesforce, you actually have the possibility in a handler that when someone creates a new element, at that moment you could go create a column in the database. And then when they delete that element, you could delete the column from the database. And you can even capture when that handler is being created, when new handlers are being added to the form. And let's see if we can go through some of them. And pause, let's see. All right. We're back to that overview page, and this gets simpler because handlers are a lot easier than elements. It's just an overview of all the handlers installed and just shows you some of the tricks, some of the little nuances. The thing I'll emphasize is like handlers, you define cardinality. Most handlers are unlimited, so when I say cardinality, it means you could have hundreds of emails attached to a web form. Kind of makes sense. Just like, why not? But the debug handler is a great example where you only want one debugger attached to a web form. And if you were doing a tight integration with like Salesforce, you probably only want one Salesforce plugin. It depends on, depends on your use case. A lot of cases you can just say unlimited and they'll work as you'd expect. And what else is there? Oh, this is a little nuance too, is like WebForm has the ability to turn, you can have no data stored in your database, but some handlers require a record to be written in the database. I think it's going to scroll down to it. Let's see. Scroll. See, this is the problem of, all right. Can't scroll to the scheduled email handler at the bottom of the list, but there's support for scheduled emails. You have to have a database to schedule an email because you have to have a place to be like, okay, here's the data I want to send. Here's when I want to send it. So just quickly, this is the contact form. These are the handlers. I don't think I'm going to click through much because what I really want to get to is to emphasize what the interface is. Yep. So this is the interface. By the way, there's a theme here. Look at the interface. I didn't know that when I did the presentation, but as I went through it and I realized that every single aspect of code that you talk about comes down to looking at the interface. And what you're going to see when we go through the interface is, yes, there's some constant cardinality, constants, whether results are, this is all the metadata, just like being able to look and understand what's going on. But what we're going to get to is the key ones, which are, see, scroll, 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 methods, like altering the elements, and then override settings, and what we're getting familiar with, form, altering a form, validate, submit, and confirm form. All these behaviors you can hook into, and then what I emphasize about entities. So any entity hook that you could think of is available in the handler. And let's see if we got some more to go through. Oh, you can tweak the confirmation page. And finally, these are just those, these are kind of rare cases, but the fact that you can know what's going on. Basically, a handler captures everything. It's really important to emphasize. It's in one place, which has a big strength compared to hooks, but we'll get to it. Okay, let's see if we, I think we're, and, oh, there's an example for that. There's an example of a handler that you can use to copy, get things started, and this is the code behind the example handler. And hopefully it'll just, it's a really simple example. Let's see if it scrolls. It's injecting the token because it supports messages. And right there, ridiculously simple handler, where basically all it's doing is letting you display a custom message, and the debug, when you turn it on, does one really cool thing. It will, so get saved. These are all little callbacks, so that if you, this example, if you turn it on and start working with it and leave these in place, you're going to get little notifications as each single method is invoked at different points. So it helps you understand the call stack. As like the example would be, you render a form, you're going to see that alter form will be rendered first. Then when someone hits submit, it'll go validate, then submit, and then confirm. It's a good way to understand what's going on. And these are so simple. Just pass the function in. I think we're getting to the end. Boy, that's a good notification. I'm good. I'm good on time. Okay, exporters are really simple plugins because they're used to download submissions into spreadsheets. This is what we just looked at in the beginning. That drop-down menu are all the plugins. And exporter plugins, once again, this is one where you must extend an existing plugin. There's no real way to get started. They're really simple, but it does a lot of the heavy lifting when you get into the delimited web form exporter, which generates a CSV. You extend that, you can build out any type of CSV you want. There are Drush commands available for automation. I don't think people always notice that. And we're getting a lot simpler because there's three key things to think about. The configuration behind the exporter, what you're going to write out, like header, footer, record, and if you have files associated with that handler, how you're going to do the file naming convention. It's freezing in here. I'll admit that too. Really simple, 4 of them. Now this one's really quick because there's the 4. We looked at this already. In code, what's nice about this is, I'm just showing you the interface because this gets lighter and lighter because this is just a couple of pieces of metadata around it, but then you get to that's the heart of it. This is what a handler, the exporter, this is all it is. You write the header, write the submission, write the footer. And then at the bottom, we're just talking about file names. And there is no example for this because it's too simple. So really what I'm just emphasizing is the table exporter. And it's going to scroll to the key part of this, which is that you can toggle it into Excel. I want you to see this. That's just the HTML header that's going, like if you want to generate an HTML table, WebForm's really basic. If you want to impress your client, you can go manipulate the heck out of this and put logos that open up in Excel and extra metadata and pie charts or anything you'd want. We're going to keep going. Save. All right. No more demos, so I'm good. I can wrap this up. And hooks are easy. Hooks, I mean, just implementing web form hooks. Hooks are functions that define or alter behaviors. Handlers and hooks are really similar. They're very similar concepts. The big difference is handlers are applied to a single form. You take this handler, you attach it to the form. That's what it's acting on. Hooks can be applied to all forms. So it does open up. If you need a behavior on all forms, you got to use hooks. It's the best way to go. And it's important to emphasize, like, people are like, how do you manipulate web form data and stuff? They're entities. So all entity hooks are applicable to web forms, everything. The web form you can manipulate, the web form submission you can manipulate. And I just like saying, you know, plugins and event subscribers are kind of the new hooks for Drupal 8. I think hooks will be around for a while, but these are two concepts that you need to get more comfortable with in Drupal 8. I'm just doing a quick form alter example of just manipulating the actions. These are the submit buttons, and just making them large and putting some margin on it. And what these two slides just show you is, yeah, I'm using a form alter hook. And now I'm using I'm altering the actual element type, and it's a slightly different, same exact output, but slightly different code to get that to happen. And this is a high overview of all the hooks available, and there's a webform.api.php file that will kind of give you some docs on this. The only one I want to call out, because it's my favorite hook I've ever written, and I'm going to say it out loud because it's so ridiculous. Hook, webform, handler, invoke, alter. So what this hook does is it sits in front of every single invocation of a handler on every single web form and allows you to manipulate what's about to happen. What's powerful about that is, like, let's say you could use it to capture right before a remote post is about to go out and manipulate the data or change the URL. or you can do almost anything. It just gives you this, it allows you to hook into any aspect of your form as it's going on globally. It makes it possible you don't have to extend, a plugin to make, a handler to make a minor tweak to something. So wrapping it up, so this is my info for connecting with me. I have a blog, jrockowitz.com. It's good, jrockowitz is the way to find me. jrockowitz.com for my blog, on Drupal.org. You can kind of ping me through that. I respond on Twitter, and I think more important if you want help with the WebForm module is this slide, which is the Slack channel is a great place to ask quick questions. I have helped a lot of people with these It's so easy. You throw up a simple question like my default properties aren't showing or something, and we can usually answer it really quickly, and people are pretty active in helping out. I also love Drupal Answers. I think that's where everyone should be going to put their general support questions. But if you have issues, definitely go to the issue queue. That's the key place. And finally, Ralph, my 14-year-old dog, says thank you. All right. Questions? A mountain of information. Okay.
I just have one question.
All right.
And what do you think, after having done all of this, what do you think was the most difficult part to figure out to name it?
Access controls got really squirrely. Like that, we ran into that. Like there's a lot of levels of access controls we didn't go into, but like you can control who can access through permissions, through the form, through the element. And then the problem with access controls with those, this is getting a little technical, with results you have to set up cache tags. So when you say someone can't access, you also have to say, okay, cache this in this way. That got really squirrely. The only other one, which I'm actually, if you look at the queue, I'm working on finishing is conditional logic. That is just a beast to set up conditional logic that works and is sane, and the amount of test coverage that you need for good conditional logic is a lot. Other than that, a lot of things is just like a lot of the elements are just rote repetitive tasks. Like, okay, we need this element and just have to create it and find an hour or two to start the work. Any other questions, or that's it?
Has there been any work towards making submission fields exposed in views so that you could have a web form, like let's say a product review web form, and be able to display a carousel or something of bits and pieces of the review?
Yeah. Alexander has been working on that. So he's the maintainer of the WebForm views module. So that has integration. It gets your data, like you can create WebForm views. And there's even a little video, like in one of the resources I linked to videos, and I recently also what we did was make it real. It's a little complicated to understand how to do it. That's why there's a dedicated video, but you can get those views that you create perfectly embedded in the WebForm UI. So you can replace that results table completely with it's done where every edge case you could think of, that results table you could replace with a view, or you could keep the results table and get a drop-down menu with your view up below it, or you can have multiple views on that results table. So you can basically create any type of display your client would need. And once you're in view, what's great, what you're hinting at, is once you're in views, a whole world opens up. Like you can get pie charts and you can get aggregate results and stuff like that.
Yay.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Anything else? Okay, guys, thank you.